Hello, you are now entering the infinite void. Hang on tight. We cannot save you now.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I'm your co-host Jacob.
And I'm your co-host Matty, and today's episode is part 1 in our new series on nuclear energy.
Yeah, so that should be quite an interesting one. I know you've wanted to talk about this for some time, and I'm surprised, if I'm honest with you, we haven't spoken about it yet too much. I don't think we've actually spoken about it, so that's pretty cool that we haven't managed to get around to that yet, because I know this is something that you've wanted to do for a while.
Yeah, I think we touched on it in our previous series on energy in general. We sort of spoke about it as an option, but yeah, this is going to be a 3-part series again, sort of similar to our last series that we did. So today's episode, part 1, is going to be sort of brief introduction to nuclear energy, what it's about, how it works, and looking at, I guess, sort of the earlier developments. And then part 2, so next episode, is going to be sort of starting with the Chernobyl nuclear incident, which I'm sure everyone has heard of at least, up to now. So looking at sort of how modern nuclear technology has developed and the sort of part it plays in our current world. And then finally, part 3 is going to be our future nuclear energy, where we're going to be looking at future designs, sort of what part nuclear energy may play in our energy mix going forwards, and also looking at nuclear fusion, which we're going to explain probably a bit about today as well. So should be good. It's going to be lots of science, lots of history, lots of politics probably as well.
Yeah, I think going forward as well, this kind of like series setup that we have, I think it's quite good. Kind of like taking the approach of like past, present, and future, and then like assessing different situations. So yeah, I think hopefully listeners agree too. From what we've seen, people seem to enjoy it, so that's good. But yeah, I think this one is going to be an interesting one. It's like you're saying, there's many different like layers to it and different aspects to it that we can kind of talk about. And I think this episode, anyway, an introduction to nuclear energy, I'm going to find the most interesting, because prior to the last like 2 weeks worth of doing research and stuff, this is all like relatively new to me. Obviously, I've done the stuff that everybody does in school, where you learn about like isotopes and like what radioactive material is and how nuclear power plants work and all that kind of stuff. And living in mid Wales, is actually one north of me a little bit that it looks kind of cool. It looks similar to the Simpsons thing. It's got the big cool down tower and stuff, but it's not like one of those massive ones. But yeah, so for me, this was quite an interesting thing to learn about, because obviously I've seen a lot of stuff on my time on Twitter where there's been a lot of memes about nuclear energy and how people back in the day kind of denied it, and it's cost more money now, or there's been more damage to the planet than if they'd have done it back then, and all this kind of stuff. So for me, it was very interesting to like kind of actually learn a little bit about the history and stuff. So hopefully anyone else that maybe isn't too clued up on this kind of gets something from this episode before we kind of deep dive in part 2 and part 3.
Yeah, I think what people find is, and obviously we can only do a certain amount in one episode, but if people are interested about it, sort of just go and read, literally just get on Wikipedia and start reading about this. You'll soon go down the rabbit hole of sort of the history of all this stuff. But you can actually get quite far just using a bit of high school knowledge, and just sort of like reading about it. Yeah, you can sort of begin to see how these things work, because although it took a long time for scientists to sort of understand the physics behind this and sort of what is actually happening inside the atom, it's and even now it's a complicated field. In essence, it's a pretty simple concept of let these rocks produce energy. We capture it by usually sort of boiling water and use it to drive a turbine. It's that simple. It's you compare it to sort of other ways of generating energy when we talk about like solar panels, having to think about like semiconductors and sort of electrons, all this sort of stuff. It's pretty straightforward, and you can get quite a long way into it just by reading about it briefly with high school physics. So hopefully people will find it interesting today.
Before we kind of kick off, what do you think? Do you think that there is a stigma around it at all still?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people sort of have a preconceived notion of what nuclear energy is. When people think about nuclear, I imagine the vast majority, the first thing they think about is Chernobyl. So, I'm not excluded from that. And there are sort of issues with it. There are things that you have to be careful with. Obviously, there's a lot of energy contained in it, but I think it's probably a bit unfair, to be honest. And there's the big, obviously, issue with it is the safety of it, which has improved massively over the last 50 years. And we'll talk about that more in episode 2 when we talk about sort of newer designs and stuff. Also, the radioactive waste issue, which is an issue, but I think it's a much more manageable issue than other ways of generating energy. And hopefully, as nuclear fusion starts to take off, as it seems to be happening now, that will then be eradicated as well. So, for me, I think we sort of shot ourselves in the foot a bit by not nuclear fission, which we're going to be predominantly talking about today in the next episode, would have been an ideal sort of holdover from like the early days, like 1950s, 60s, with like the first sort of ones until, say, 2050, 2060, when we start to get commercial nuclear fusion.
Yeah.
And by sort of delaying it so much, people, have begun to sort of be a bit wary of it because they're just not familiar with it. And we're sort of starting to get near the end of its useful lifetime because nuclear fusion will hopefully take off. Nuclear power plants are insanely expensive to build and complex to manage. And it makes sense to build them with a view of, they're going to sort of hold us over for 50 to 100 years, not, we're going to build one quickly and use it for 10 or 15 years while we have, the Russian oil crisis and stuff. It just doesn't work like that. So we sort of, I sort of push for nuclear energy, but we've sort of missed the mark a bit, and we're getting to the point now where whether this is even worthwhile doing or whether we just sort of save that money and try and leapfrog to nuclear fusion in a big way. So, yeah. Hopefully that, I think I went off on a tangent then.
That kind of answers it. I've always kind of seen it as like, not completely the same, but kind of like the analogy of kind of like the idea of people being scared of like flying on like a plane when they take other forms of transport.
Yeah.
Like I've always found that with like nuclear in comparison to like other ones, because there's been bad stories or because of how it gets depicted in like pop culture with like The Simpsons, for instance, or something like that. I think like the general consensus, the idea that people have of it is that it's like dangerous and things go wrong. And it's like you're saying, like technology has got so much better since like Chernobyl, for instance. And even like, it's not just the technology, it's like the hardware, it's the algorithms, it's everything that is thrown into that too, that the management and everything, you know what I mean? It's not just humans now. There's like actual foresight.
Yeah. Well, as we'll discuss next time, unfortunately, Chernobyl was a poorly designed reactor that was run badly. Like that's the fundamental of it. Like, and that can happen in any industry. And what you said about sort of comparing it to air travel is exactly it. And I can't remember the term for it now. It's some sort of psychology term that we tend to focus on the weird big events that sort of grab our attention rather than the sort of continual risk of stuff. Like when a plane goes down and kills 150 people, which happens maybe once a year, say, that makes all the news. But the fact that a few thousand people a year die in cars, just nobody cares about.
Or you're scared to go on a plane because you think it's going to crash and you smoke 20 cigarettes a day.
And it's the same with nuclear energy. There's been a handful of nuclear disasters that have been bad and sort of not contained in sort of 60, 70 years of operation, and have killed as a result of cancer and sort of issues like that. We're talking thousands of people in that time. Compare that to the amount of people that are killed by pollution from coal plants and stuff like that. So pollution kills hundreds of thousands of people a year. So I mean,
that's fair. One thing I did want to ask though is like, wasn't when they were testing the nuclear bomb, because I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point too, but wasn't when they were testing the nuclear bomb, wasn't there a chance that it could have ignited the atmosphere in like a chain reaction?
I think that was dismissed quite early on, but it was a concern that the amount of energy it would release would.
Because this was like before they tested it, wasn't it? So they weren't entirely sure.
Yeah. I mean, shall we make a start? Because I'll come back to that. Sort of just like how quickly things have developed.
Yeah, let's do it. Do you want to kick it off, or do you want me to kick it off?
I'll do the first bit then. So, as I said earlier, nuclear energy at its heart is a sort of natural process that releases energy, and we use that energy in some form. So, in a nuclear bomb, that energy is released. There's an explosion. In a nuclear power plant, it's the same thing, but we capture that energy by boiling water and then driving a turbine. And there are two types of nuclear power. So that is nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So nuclear fission is large sort of molecules, large elements. So uranium decaying into smaller elements. And when it does that, it releases energy. And that is ultimately one of the bad things about nuclear fission, is that you produce these sort of decay elements, and usually they're things like cesium, which is not great and difficult to contain. And also the actual nuclear fuel itself is very radioactive. So uranium has a half-life of, I think, thousands or tens of thousands a year. So even if you use your nuclear reactor for 50 years, you only actually use a very small amount of fuel and end up with loads of waste products and loads of leftover uranium. So that's the issue with sort of nuclear fission. And then the other one is nuclear fusion, which we'll talk about more sort of in our future episode 3, where you are sort of forcing small elements together. So hydrogen, helium, the sort of very smallest elements, fusing them together, and then that also releases energy. The benefit of that is that neither the fuel nor the sort of product of it is particularly dangerous. It's basically just sort of gases that are found in the atmosphere in large quantities. So, it's pretty safe, and it also has the possibility of producing a lot more energy for complex physics reasons.
And that's what the sun does as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, so sun has powered nuclear fusion, and we are sort of now sort of beginning to make nuclear fusion reactors. The problem is that to force these, say, hydrogen together, you need extremely high temperatures, surface of the core of the sun temperatures, and very, very high densities as well. And trying to actually contain that in a physical thing is difficult, because the moment that your nuclear plasma touches anything, it will destroy it. So you end up having to sort of contain it within magnetic donuts, where it doesn't actually touch any of the surface of anything. So it's pretty cool, but also very difficult. So
it's crazy that like humans figure all that out, though. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. It's mad, and I guess that sort of brings me on to the first bit I was going to talk about, was like this early development of nuclear energy. Is that when you look at the science that went into it, I've got a little timeline here of things that were discovered. 1895 is the first thing on this timeline, which is Roentgen discovers X-rays. These are, before then we didn't have any idea of this stuff even existed. And over the next couple of years, you've got, Becquerel discovers that these sort of rays were emitted from uranium salts, and the Curie's discovering radioactive nucleotides. Rutherford, 1920, theorizes a neutron. So, we're already like 20 years into the 20th century, and we are just theorizing the neutron. It's like, and then 1932, Chadwick identifies a neutron. So, pretty much at the this is the thing that sort of I think a lot of people don't really understand or appreciate, is that at the outbreak of the war, of World War II, 1939, we were literally just getting to the point of like, oh, we could get energy like from this. And then 5 years later, we had created a nuclear bomb. It's an insane amount of work went into this.
It actually is. What do you think that is? Because like, it is mad, the intelligence boom that we had as like a species.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? What do you think influenced that? Is it just pop culture? Is it ourselves? Is it just standard? Do all intelligent life forms, when they've been around for a certain amount of time, just discover it?
I think part of it is around this time there was a lot of other things going on that developed, other technologies that will help. That's definitely a part of it. Also, we do see it with other fields as well. So like before this, like discovery of electromagnetism, there was like a period with about 20, 30 years where electromagnetism just took off, because a lot of this science, as I said, is fundamental, like high school level stuff.
Yeah.
In that it's very obvious to try and conceptualize ideas. I'm not trying to sort of undermine the work that was done and like how important and sort of insanely intelligent it was, but like, you get lucky and see X-rays have done something, you will immediately want to know why that's happened.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who it was now, but someone left. I think it was I can't remember. Maybe Rutherford at one point just happened to have some uranium, a rock, left it in a cupboard with some photographic paper, and then observed that the photographic paper had been developed, had been like exposed without having been exposed to sunlight. And these sorts of things, once you start to see one bit of that, you sort of have to very quickly come up with ideas. So like in the space of like 20 years, we have like seeing effects of radioactivity, like theorizing the structure of the atom and stuff, because it's so fundamental that there's just nothing else that can explain it. A lot of science we have now, it takes a lot of people and a lot of time, because there's a lot of competing ideas. When you see something like the merger of black holes, for example, with LIGO, amazing discovery, but it's such a complicated thing, and it requires so many people thinking about it, that you could easily say, oh, it's black holes merging, or it's this, or it's that, or lots of different things. With this, you go, oh, this rock is able to produce something that develops photographic paper. It's obviously not glowing light. I can see that it's not glow in the dark. So, what is it doing? You have to sort of very quickly come up with these new ideas. I think that's part of it. It's just fundamental science. There's nothing to explain it. So you get these sort of stepping stones of people discovering stuff quite quickly. So yeah, that's my perception of it anyway.
No, that's a solid suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have thought then now it kind of would have been a similar thing, because like we've got computers, we've got the ability to like just allow them to try and figure things out. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That we might be moving into a time where there's like another boom, but I guess we are having a boom, aren't we? There's always a boom now. We're just on that incline of forever knowledge and technological pushing boundaries and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think you also need some sort of external pressure as well. So like,
war is helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Americans were so, and the British and the Allies were so sort of fearful that the Nazis would create a nuclear bomb first. They just had to do it as quickly as possible. But, it's this combination of it being very fundamental science with a lot of very clever people working on it and building off each other, and this external pressure creating the nuclear bomb. So it's quite similar to sort of the moon missions in the 1960s. But in that case, it was sort of engineering based rather than science based. But yeah.
Just trying to find where we are on the timeline.
we've wiggled out of it.
I think we were just before World War II, weren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So beginning of World War II, you start to get these the sort of beginnings of nuclear energy. So 1939, Fermi and Slizard measure neutron multiplication and conclude that nuclear chain reaction is possible. So nuclear fission relies on nuclear chain reaction. So you have one atom splits, and if that atom just split and that was it, then that would be the end of your nuclear fission. Like, it would just happen. There's not a great deal amount of energy in just one single atom just because it's so small. But then if your fission releases something which induces fission in something else, so when uranium splits, it releases neutrons which then collide with other uranium atoms. That's when you get this nuclear chain reaction. So beginning of World War II, 1939, we start to get the first sort of literally back of the envelope calculations that nuclear fission is possible and could sustain itself in a nuclear chain reaction. And when you're looking at a nuclear chain reaction, either you want a runaway reaction, so that is one atom splits and creates two, and means that two atoms splits, and then four atoms splits, and then etc. etc. And then you've got a nuclear bomb. Or you want it as a sustained reaction where one atom splits and makes one more atom split, and then one more atom split, because that means that your energy output is consistent, and that's what you want for a nuclear power plant, this sort of consistent level of output. And they're the same process. It's literally just a case of how you sort of create that reaction and sustain it. As I said, with a nuclear bomb, you literally just induce it as fast as possible to release the energy in one go. Nuclear power plants, they use neutron blockers. So literally, if your uranium atom releases 3 neutrons, they physically put things in the way. So usually boron control rods that absorb 2 of the neutrons, so that your one reaction only creates one more reaction, sort of thing. So
it's never going to go like unstable or anything like that.
It shouldn't do. But yeah, it's and that's, I think, in essence, we sort of covered like what nuclear fission is there. Is you're just trying to control the decay of something which is naturally decaying, and it can either be very quick or slow or somewhere in between, so that you get the right amount of power from it, energy per second kind of thing.
Yeah. And then when it comes to like nuclear bombs, they obviously use, is it different material for different bombs, or is it just the quantity of the material? Or is it like you're saying again, is it more so the reaction of the material? So like they're deciding how it's reacting with each other when it comes to like the sizes of them, because there's like different ones, isn't there? Like I've seen like those classic videos of like the Tsar bomb that Russia has.
Yeah, so you completely reminded me. I've completely overlooked the Tsar bomber, but we'll start with the ones from World War II. So World War II was this idea of nuclear fission. So that is this nuclear chain reaction of heavy elements. So I think what a lot of people don't know is that the Americans actually, the Fat Man and Little Boy bombs were entirely separate designs. And you asked if you could use different materials and stuff. Well, the 2 of those did actually use entirely different designs and materials. So, which way around it? So, Fat Man, which was the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, was an implosion type bomb that used plutonium. So, plutonium-239 is another heavy radioactive element. And the key concept with a nuclear bomb is this thing called critical mass or critical density. So to induce a nuclear chain reaction that would create a bomb, you need enough atoms in close proximity to each other.
Right.
Like if you imagined, just take your room now and you had two atoms in it, and one decays and then sends neutrons off, it's very unlikely that the second atom would decay in the next second or next 10 seconds. The neutrons will fly off. They probably wouldn't hit it.
Yeah.
And even if you lined your room with lead so that the neutrons kept reflecting around, the actual chances of it hitting the other atom are very, very small.
Yeah.
And you can say, on average, the second atom will go off in probably years, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you start to bring those atoms closer and closer to each other, so that they're very, very close, you can get it so that your first atom has a very high chance of inducing the second atom to sort of undergo nuclear fission. And that's what you're trying to do. So critical density, critical mass are the same thing. You can either just get more and more nuclear material, and if you take a big lump of it, the stuff in the middle of it is going to be putting stuff out and almost certainly releasing neutrons into other atoms because it's just surrounded by loads of it.
Yeah.
Or the other idea of critical density is you have a fixed mass and then you compress it so that all of the atoms are in a very, very small area. And again, you make sure that the neutrons are colliding with other atoms and inducing a chain reaction. So that's a bit of science that people can pick up on. Critical density, critical mass, that is the key for undergoing a nuclear chain reaction.
Right.
So as I said, Fat Man used plutonium and it was implosion type design. So it had basically just a sphere of metal plutonium in the middle of it. I think a few kilograms of plutonium just sat there, and then they surrounded the entire thing in a very accurate and symmetrical grouping of explosives. I think those explosives were essentially just conventional explosives. So I don't know the exact material, but let's just say dynamite sort of thing.
Yeah.
You set the dynamite goes off, and because you've laid it around this ball of plutonium, the plutonium ball crushes in on itself under an implosion, and that gets you to the correct critical density where it's able to sustain its own nuclear reaction. So, as I said, like nuclear fission is a natural process. Like your ball of plutonium is going to be radioactive and undergoing nuclear fission, but only when you actually crush it down into this critical density bit is it able to then sustain itself as a chain reaction. So, and
is that kind of like then what the sun is doing? It's being like crushed down, but then sustaining itself for a massive period of time. But that's fission, isn't it? Not fusion.
The sun is fusion. Plutonium is. I was going the way around. So the sun is a fusion thing. Similar concept if you need to create this sort of critical density, but rather than it being it doesn't rely on sort of releasing of neutrons. It's literally just stuff being crushed together, forced together through the reaction. But so critical density and the implosion device was Fat Man, and they didn't think that was going to work. So the actual Trinity test, so the first detonation of a time bomb, was this implosion type device, but basically because they didn't think it was going to work, and it did. So, but as I said, the other device, so Little Boy, was an entirely different type of design that they were pretty confident with, so they didn't bother testing this one. And that was one sort of based on critical mass. So this one used uranium, and essentially what they did, they had one piece of uranium which was subcritical mass, so not heavy enough for it to sustain chain reaction, and then they created a bullet of another lump of subcritical mass uranium, and literally just fired one piece into the other to create one blob that was big enough very quickly. And that's what it was. It's pretty, as I said, a lot of this stuff is quite simple. Yeah, so it's essentially just a small cannon that fired a piece of uranium. It was a hollow point target, so the thing sort of crushes in on itself as it goes, and just fired it into another uranium target to create a supercritical lump of uranium. That was it.
So the atomic bomb came before the atomic kind of like generator or facility.
Yes, this you can see here that just firing pieces of uranium into each other is not particularly sophisticated.
Yeah,
it's quite simple. The difficulty with nuclear power is that you're trying to do that, but rather than releasing all your energy from the uranium in a fraction of a second, you're trying to release that energy over the course of days or weeks.
Yeah. Well, it'd be like figuring out how to make a fire and then figuring out how to keep a fire going sustainably throughout the winter.
Yeah, exactly.
Like two different things. Yeah. Okay.
I guess if you sort of, if you somehow at the dawn of civilization had petrol, it would probably not take you that long to realize that if you chucked a load of petrol onto a fire, you would create an absolutely massive
Yeah.
But trying to develop a way where you would sort of like feed the petrol onto the fire to keep it going nice and hot, but then without it sort of igniting itself, that it's the same concept.
Yeah.
Destruction is usually easier than anything constructive. So,
and 9 times out of 10, we've probably discovered things through destruction before we have for reasons of survival.
Yeah. But yeah, those are the two types of bombs that were developed as part of the Manhattan Project in World War II. Since then, there have been lots of other bombs. So, these fission devices, uranium, there's lots of different ways you can do it. So some of them, rather than having like a jacket of conventional explosives around plutonium, will actually use a uranium type device to cause the implosion of the plutonium device. Just to try and get as much energy out of it as possible. The Tsar bomber that you mentioned was an H bomb, so that used nuclear fusion. And I think, if I'm correct, they use a nuclear fission device to trigger the nuclear fusion. So in order to create the heat and pressure required for nuclear fusion to commence, which produces a lot of energy, they use one of these sort of nuclear fission devices to produce that. So
madness.
It's all sort of tied up in each other. It's basically a question of, can you get enough material close enough together to make it go supercritical, make it have this chain reaction effect. That's essentially what you've got to try and do. As I said, trying to do that just firing a bit of uranium at another is quite easy, but trying to do that in a peaceful way is much harder.
Well, even the first person that fired the uranium at the uranium, were they aware or had an idea of how big it could be?
So in the Manhattan Project, again, I'd suggest people sort of go and read more about it because it is fascinating. And in fact, I saw there's a movie coming out next year called Oppenheimer.
Nice.
So Robert Oppenheimer is he was sort of the overseer. He was a physicist, but he was the overseer of the Manhattan Project, and he's the one that used the phrase when he saw the nuclear bomb, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." He was an interesting character, but that the Manhattan Project is pretty insane in that at the time of the Trinity test, at the time the nuclear bomb went off, there probably would have been less than a dozen people that knew that device existed and what it would do, despite there being tens of thousands of people working on it. So one of the a lot of people. There was a site called Oak Ridge in Tennessee where they produced a lot of the nuclear material, and it was completely sealed off. Families were brought in, and you'd have typically the dad in those days would go and work at the nuclear plant in the day, and the family would live on site and they wouldn't see anyone. But the people who were working on the devices and stuff were not told anything about what they were doing. Some of them were literally given like Geiger counters to try and measure and record radiation levels in the site and stuff, and they were just given the things and just told to write down the numbers. They would not have any idea what they were doing.
Wow.
It's speculated, obviously, that even people at the test site who were like physically next to this thing, who were like rigging it up and rigging up electronics, just would not have known what it was. So someone would have, there would have been physicists that would have crunched the numbers and would have written down on a piece of paper, oh, we're going to get so many kilotons of TNT output equivalent sort of thing. But even they might have known what they were actually doing. So they might have just looked at the numbers and passed it off to someone else who
it's like super like compartmentalized where everyone might be working on a small part of the big picture kind of thing.
Yeah, as I said, like there would have been maybe less than a dozen people that would know about this. President of the United States, and then maybe a few of sort of defense ministers, and then a few scientists on the Manhattan Project itself, and that would have been about it. So,
just out of curiosity, where do you kind of like fall on that? Do you think it's good that like government projects and stuff, when they are working on like this kind of stuff, that they do compartmentalize it, or do you think it like slows down innovation? Because do you think maybe like people could have got there quicker if they'd have maybe known more and just maybe have just had ideas to bring to the table? Or do you think that this is probably the safest and best way to kind of go about it because oversight is always needed, kind of thing?
Yeah, I think in this situation, I probably err on the side of secrecy. It's in the context of World War II. There would have been spies. There almost certainly was spies within the Manhattan Project, and compartmentalizing it sort of it builds in an element of no one person can know too much kind of thing. In the context of World War II, I think it would have to be done, and even now with sort of secret government defense projects, part of it is sort of this like secrecy nature. Part of it is trying to make it difficult for people to sort of get hold of this information. So
that's fair.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, sort of out of World War II, then we start to get the sort of development of the first nuclear reactors. So sort of beginning in the 50s, a lot of countries, sort of obviously the USSR and Britain, France, developed their own nuclear weapons, and then started to develop nuclear projects for power, having seen the amount of energy they could produce.
Yeah, I'm just reading through it now, and then you have the 3 Mile Island reactor, which suffered partial meltdown.
Yeah,
in 1979.
Yeah, so 3 Mile Island was sort of a bit of a turning point in that it was that there was two sort of big disasters before Chernobyl. One of those was in the UK at Windscale. So Windscale Piles is a site. It's now on the Sellafield site. So I think it's Europe's biggest nuclear site. They do a lot of different stuff there. Some of the nuclear piles ignited and released a lot of radiation. But luckily they were quite small reactors. And then the other one was 3 Mile Island. So that is US. And again, that was a sort of a partial nuclear meltdown, but that was contained, I think, entirely within the sort of reactor housing. So not too much environmental damage on that one. but yeah, a lot of countries, those two things. By that point, people started to shift a bit. It was a relatively new technology. People were sort of skeptical of it,
Yeah.
and those sort of early nuclear disasters, I think, probably were necessary, to be honest, to try and sort of get more government oversight and more regulation. So these things aren't to be messed with in any way. So.
Yeah, especially in a time where people might not know what exactly it is, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
want corporation taking shortcuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was the problem with the USSR, is that in a sort of effort to catch up with the West, similar to the space race, nuclear energy was like the pinnacle of scientific achievement. And in the same way, now that you have sort of countries competing for like AI supremacy, and other fields of computing. Back then, it was nuclear energy, and the USSR trying to keep up probably overstretched themselves a bit. It's not to say that they were totally hopeless. I think 1954 they developed the first sort of nuclear power plant that was connected to a grid, and so they certainly had sort of expertise and stuff, but they were trying to do it at such a pace that they probably overdid themselves a bit, and that obviously then led eventually to Chernobyl.
Yeah, I've watched that really good documentary on Chernobyl, which was very good. It's crazy, isn't it, when everybody's there and they don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah,
and like the firefighters are going in and the kids are playing in like the ash.
Yeah, it's such a new technology then, and as I said, like a lot of people simply would not have known anything about it, and I think that's that's part of the issue back then, and probably it even now needs to be addressed, is that people just aren't educated a lot on it.
Yeah.
And obviously end up being skeptical. So yeah, but yeah, I guess sort of one thing that I wanted to discuss as well was France. They're often overlooked in this. So we talk about America obviously being a nuclear power, Russia, USSR, even Britain has sort of a bit of nuclear heritage. Japan, with Fukushima more recently, but France is sort of a standout nuclear state. So in 1954, the Prime Minister at the time, Mesmer, they had a huge sort of push for nuclear energy. So in the 70s, oil prices were spiking because of conflicts. And France now just sort of stands out absolutely miles ahead of anyone else. Something like 70% of their energy is produced by nuclear.
Yeah.
It's pretty insane. And if you compare sort of French nuclear project to Germany, it's miles ahead of anything else. Germany at the moment is sort of closing down. They're meant to be closing down by the end of this year. Their last 3 nuclear power plants, they did 3 last year. Seemingly going to replace it with coal or gas from Russia, whereas France, like 75% energy is just like fixed and it's just there all the time, every day, just ready for them to use. Like
awesome, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty, and that's why I think we sort of have shot ourselves in the foot a bit, in that this was a technology that certainly by the 80s and 90s was well proven, had a good safety record, even accounting for Chernobyl. In the West, it had an incredible safety record, and it's that idea of one nuclear disaster is not as bad as the effects of conventional energy, which has people die all the time in mining and stuff. So if we just sort of pushed for it more back then, we'd be in a position now where a significant amount of energy would be from low carbon sources.
Yeah, and we wouldn't have these crazy energy bills.
Yeah.
Anybody that's listening from the UK right now, I feel you. I think maybe next episode, you might see these guitars on fire. You're gonna have to like turn everything off. It's insane.
Yeah. But yeah,
I think that's a good spot to leave it, if I'm honest with you.
yeah. Hopefully, people have sort of got a bit of an idea of nuclear power and sort of those early days of the Manhattan Project and stuff. But
yeah, and I'll place some of these links in the description, so anybody listening, if they do want to go and look at the timeline that we've been referencing or read up on anything else, I'll place them there. I'll get Matty to send me something on the Manhattan Project too, so we've got that. But yeah, hopefully everyone's enjoyed this week's episode and is looking forward to hearing what else we've got to say on this awesome topic. For me, it's very interesting. I've wanted to learn about this for a while, so it's fun to finally kind of get my head around it a little bit more. And like you're saying, without being patronizing, it is one of those things. It's like, it's obvious, but at the same time, it's like, you just need to understand like the lingo, I guess, and like what it is.
Yeah, it can get very, very complicated. Once you start getting down to the level of the atom and you start doing the maths on it, it is very complicated. But in terms of getting an overview of how this stuff works and what's happening, I think anyone with sort of high school level physics, even if you did it 20, 30 years ago, kind of thing, you can read this sort of stuff and within half an hour, you can get an idea of how this stuff works. And as I said, I do hope sort of more people do sort of try and learn about this stuff, because it is an important. I think it's an important sort of component of our energy for the future. So
yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm sure as we talk about in future episodes on this, it could be humanity's get out of jail card. So we'll see. But yeah, if we've missed anything, or you enjoyed anything, let us know down in the comment section below, like what your favorite part was, or if we missed anything, what we should have included, and we'll try and mention it in part 2. And if you want to keep up to date with us, you can follow us on social media, which is going to be at Infinite Void Pod on both Twitter and Instagram. And we usually post when episodes are going out, polls on what topics the next series are going to be. And you can also keep up to date with what me and Matty are doing, as there's lots of retweets on the account that go through that. But if you also want to follow us, I'm at Jacob E. Carson, and Matty is at the Matty JMP. Yeah. And yeah, guys, we will catch you next episode for part 2 of our nuclear energy series. Hey everyone, we wanted to take a moment to tell you about our brand new Patreon page.
Yeah, so we've devised a load of new goodies that are neatly packaged across 3 different tiers for you.
Tiers start at £3 and go all the way up to £10 a month.
Just to say, the Patreon is in no way an obligation, and we're going to continue making the podcast as it is, freely available across all the platforms. But if you'd like to support us and show your support, you can now.
So yeah, head over to patreon.com/Infinite Void Pod for more information.